The first time words were mass-produced, no one screamed in terror, no cities burned, no tyrant rose overnight. Yet, in that quiet moment, when ink met paper at industrial scale, humanity unknowingly forged one of the most powerful weapons of control it would ever create. Because the printing press did not simply spread knowledge, it standardized truth, amplified belief, and gave those who controlled it the ability to shape reality itself. And this story does not begin with dictators barking orders or crowds raising fists. It begins with monks copying manuscripts by candlelight, with slow, fragile knowledge that could not outrun authority, where ideas traveled at the speed of a horse and power depended on swords, land, and bloodlines. But then the press arrived and everything changed at once, and not at all. Because while history loves to tell us that printing liberated minds and shattered tyranny, the darker truth is that it also made obedience scalable, propaganda permanent, and control invisible, turning belief into infrastructure and ideology into mass production. And to understand how modern dictatorships were accidentally born, we must follow the press not as a hero but as a mirror, reflecting the ambitions of those who learned how to use it first. Before the press, rulers ruled through presence, through fear made visible in gallows and banners, through ritual and tradition. But they could not be everywhere, and their voice weakened with distance, while rumors mutated and authority dissolved beyond city walls, meaning power was always fragile and contested. But printing collapsed distance, froze words into permanence, and replaced rumor with repetition, allowing a single message to echo identically across regions, languages, and generations. And for the first time in history, authority could speak in one voice to millions who would never see its face. Early reformers celebrated this miracle, believing that truth would naturally triumph once freed from gatekeepers, and for a brief moment it seemed they were right. As religious dissent exploded, old doctrines cracked and literacy spread. But what they failed to notice was that the press did not care what it printed, only that it printed consistently, and consistency is the raw material of belief, because when people encounter the same idea again and again, wrapped in symbols, rituals, and emotional language, it stops feeling like an argument and starts feeling like reality. As printing houses multiplied, rulers learned a crucial lesson faster than philosophers did. Controlling presses was cheaper than controlling armies, and persuasion was more efficient than force, because a convinced population polices itself. And this is where the accident happened, because the press was not designed to centralize power. Yet, it rewarded those who could monopolize distribution, suppress alternatives, and flood the public space with a single narrative. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, states began to regulate printers, license publications, and define what could be printed, not as censorship, but as order, not as repression, but as protection. And each small restriction was justified as necessary until entire populations learned to trust what appeared in print as authoritative, official, and true. Over time, print created a new relationship between citizens and the state, one where loyalty was no longer enforced only by fear, but cultivated through stories, myths, and shared identities, where nations themselves were printed into existence through standardized languages, common textbooks, and identical histories. And while this process helped unify fragmented societies, it also erased complexity, suppressed dissenting memories, and replaced lived experience with approved narratives, meaning that for the first time, a government could not only rule bodies, but also curate minds. The true power of the press revealed itself not in open debate, but in moments of crisis, because fear accelerates belief, and printed words carry the authority of permanence. And when societies faced war, famine, or humiliation, leaders discovered that controlling the story mattered more than controlling the facts. And so newspapers, pamphlets, and later mass circulation journals became weapons, framing enemies as monsters, sacrifices as necessary, and obedience as patriotic, while alternative voices were dismissed as traitors, liars, or enemies of progress. And what began as persuasion hardened into doctrine, and doctrine into dogma, and dogma into law. As literacy expanded, so did the illusion of choice, because people could read many things, but only within boundaries set by those who owned presses, paper supplies, and distribution networks. And this concentration of informational power created a paradox where societies felt more informed than ever while becoming more synchronized in thought. And synchronization is the dream of every authoritarian system because it reduces unpredictability, neutralizes resistance, and transforms individuals into a collective that moves as one. By the time the 20th century arrived, the infrastructure of printed control was complete, with mass education systems feeding standardized narratives, state-aligned publishers shaping public memory, and newspapers acting as unofficial arms of ideology. And when charismatic leaders emerged promising order, revival, and greatness, they did not need to invent new tools. They simply inherited a machine already built by centuries of print culture, one that taught people to trust the written word, to equate repetition with truth, and to see dissent as chaos. What made modern dictatorships different from ancient tyrannies was not cruelty, but efficiency, because they could mobilize millions without constant violence, using books, posters, slogans, and newspapers to construct alternate realities where the state was always right, the leader always heroic, and the enemy always imminent. And once this reality took hold, repression became easier, because victims were pre-labeled as dangerous, undeserving, or unreal, their erasure justified before it occurred. The tragedy is that none of this required evil genius, only the logical extension of a technology that rewarded clarity over nuance, volume over diversity, and authority over uncertainty. And as printing became faster and cheaper, the temptation to simplify the world into binaries grew stronger, because simple stories travel further, faster, and deeper. And dictators learned that complexity breeds doubt, while simplicity breeds loyalty. Even resistance movements fell into the same trap, adopting the language and methods of mass persuasion, reinforcing the idea that power belonged to whoever controlled the narrative most effectively, not whoever told the most accurate story. And thus the press became a battleground where truth was not discovered, but manufactured, contested, and often buried beneath waves of emotionally charged certainty. What makes this accident so devastating is that the press never forced anyone to lie. It merely amplified whatever was fed into it, meaning that the same tool that spread scientific knowledge and human rights could also spread hatred and obedience with equal efficiency, and societies consistently underestimated how quickly the latter could overpower the former when fear, pride, and identity were involved. As generations grew up immersed in printed realities, they learned to see the world not through direct experience, but through mediated narratives, trusting what was written over what was seen. And when states declared emergencies, enemies, or moral crusades, the printed word transformed those declarations into lived truth, shaping behavior, expectations, and even memory itself, because people remember what they are taught to remember and forget what is never printed. By the time radio and film arrived, dictatorships did not replace print. They built upon it, because print had already trained populations to accept centralized messaging, and the new media simply added speed and emotion to an existing structure of control, meaning the real revolution had already happened centuries earlier, quietly, invisibly, in ink and paper. The cruel irony is that the printing press did help dismantle old tyrannies, but in doing so it taught future tyrants how to rule more effectively, because it revealed that controlling the story controls the people, and once that lesson was learned, it could never be unlearned. Today, when we look back at modern dictatorships, we often blame individuals, ideologies, or economic conditions. Yet beneath all of them lies a deeper continuity, a system of belief production that began the moment information became mass-produced, standardized, and centralized, and the press did not ask who would wield it wisely. It simply waited to be used. The most unsettling part of this story is not that dictators exploited the printing press, but that they did so legally, incrementally, and often with public support. Because each regulation, each necessary restriction, each official publication was framed as protecting society from chaos, misinformation, or moral decay, and step by step, freedom of thought narrowed, while the illusion of informed consent expanded. When citizens read the same headlines, the same textbooks, the same histories, they begin to share not just knowledge, but assumptions. And assumptions are the foundation of obedience, because they define what questions are even allowed to be asked. And dictatorships thrive, not by silencing every voice, but by shaping the boundaries of imagination itself. In this way, the printing press did not create dictators directly, but it created the conditions under which dictatorship could appear normal, rational, and even desirable, especially during moments of uncertainty, when people crave clarity more than freedom and certainty more than truth. The accident was believing that access to information automatically produces wisdom, when in reality it produces influence. And influence always seeks power, and power always seeks permanence. And permanence is easiest to achieve when belief is printed, archived, and endlessly repeated. As long as humans seek meaning, belonging, and simple explanations for complex worlds, the legacy of the printing press will remain ambiguous, a tool capable of liberation and domination in equal measure. And the rise of modern dictatorships is not a betrayal of its promise, but a fulfillment of its deepest logic. Because the moment truth became reproducible, so did lies, and the moment belief became scalable, so did control. And somewhere between ink and authority, the future quietly chose obedience, not because it was forced, but because it was printed.